Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So this afternoon I've got another lecture for those who attended previously. So what we'll be talking about is we'll be talking about ways to clean and optimize your computer. Let me grab my remote. So why do we need to clean and optimize our computers? So typically what we'll notice is after time computers tend to get a little bit slower. Especially if you compare it to the speed when you first bought your computer when it was new. You might notice that your computer takes a little bit longer to turn on than it used to. Your computer might warn you that's low on disk space, so you might get warnings there as well. And if you have an older computer, you tend to have a lot more problems with an older computer than you just bought a brand new computer as well. Okay? So if you have any of these symptoms, it's actually probably time to give your computer a good cleaning. Okay? So what causes these problems? So typically a slow startup is typically what's happening when your computer starts up is it's actually loading the operating system. So if you're running Windows, it's loading up Windows. Windows is actually stored on your hard drive. And for Windows to start up, it actually has to load the operating system. Okay? And the reason it's stored on your hard drive is it makes it easy for you to update it if there's problems. You can change your operating system if you don't like Windows. Like if you have Windows Vista, you can upgrade it to Windows 7, and that's because it's stored on your hard drive, making it very easy to upgrade. So during the startup process, what Windows is doing, it's loading a lot of files. Sometimes when you install programs and then you uninstall them, they might have fragments left over during startup. Okay? So your computer could be wasting time looking for files that aren't there. The other thing that happens is after you install programs, these programs might add stuff to the startup. Okay? So something like antivirus, what will happen is on startup it's going to load the antivirus. And the other thing the antivirus will typically do is they'll do a startup scan. So the first time you start up the computer, that antivirus will be actually running a scan in the background. So you notice your computer tends to be a little bit slower right after you turn on your computer as well. And if you have a lot of programs installed, a lot of these programs might have startup items as well. So very common is for programs to have updaters. So when you start up the program, that updater will load up and it'll actually stay resident in your memory. And what it's trying to do is it just wants to update the program. I don't actually like that philosophy of actually having a little program run in the background just to update software you may or may not be using. Okay? Another problem that might cause slow startup is fragmentation. We'll talk about fragmentation a little bit later on. But that's just startup, okay? But if in general your computer runs slowly, there's a couple of problems you might have. One is low storage space. So we'll talk about the problems about that a little bit later on. You might have too many programs running in the background. And you also could have viruses as well. That causes slow running on your computer. But it could be a hardware issue. You could just need more memory. We'll talk about memory issues a little bit later on as well. Okay, so the first step we want to do if we want to try to clean up our computer is we want to uninstall unused programs. So how we remove programs that we don't want, we typically go into our control panel in Windows. We're going to go into the add remove option and we're going to look for all the programs that were installed. What happens when we buy software or we download software is we have to install it to make it work. Okay, well, what happens when we install the programs, typically the programs are compressed when we download them and uninstall them, we'll uncompress them. The other thing it will do is it will actually take those files and put them onto our computer. And the other thing that installation will do is it might add the program into our start menu. And the last thing it might do is it could have processes running in the background. And it will also modify a file called a registry. And what the registry is, it's a file that's used by Windows. It's mainly all the settings. So all the settings of Windows are stored in the registry. But all the programs that are installed, they will add entries in the registry as well. So all the settings for the programs that you install are stored in the registry as well. So what the problem is, some programs, if you uninstall them, they might not clean up the registry that well. They might leave stuff still in the registry. And also when you install programs, typically there might be programs that are additionally installed with it as well. Okay? So by using the add remove, you can go through all the programs that you're not using and you want to remove them. Okay? But typically you can't just delete a program. Some people go in their program files, they go into their folders, they'll just delete that folder, but that does a very unclean install because you're still leaving items in the registry when you do that. Okay? So if you do the add remove from your control panel, that tends to do a cleaner install, but it might not be completely clean, so it might still leave stuff left over. And we'll talk about getting rid of those leftover items a little bit later on. If you look into your programs that are installed on your computer, you might find lots of programs. You might not recognize a lot of those programs. You might think, I don't remember using this program or installing this program. And that's because a lot of programs will have helper applications. So you might install some software, and instead of installing just that one program, it'll actually install some helper applications. So you might end up installing 3 or 4 programs as well. Those helper applications tend to be libraries or something like that, but they're kind of required for that program to run. So if you don't recognize something and you uninstall it and all of a sudden one of your programs doesn't work, it's because you uninstalled like a helper application. So those are a little bit tricky to remove if you're not too sure if you need them or not. The other thing that happens if you install software is sometimes you might want a certain application, but then it installs about 5 or 6 other applications as well. And a good example is iTunes. If you ever downloaded iTunes and installed iTunes, iTunes installs about 5 or 6 different programs, okay? And most of those programs you actually don't need. So iTunes installs something called QuickTime, which is a media player. Installs a program called Bonjour. I'm not sure what that does. There's an Apple Updater. There's an iPod service that runs in the background. And you typically don't need all those programs just to run iTunes, okay? QuickTime is a media player that plays back the Apple's video format. The iPod service is so you can connect your iPod up to iTunes. Apple Updater will update the software. Because if you don't have an iPod, what's the point of installing the iPod service, right? It's just going to be running and you don't need it. Okay? So I actually don't like iTunes because it has all this extra stuff that I don't want on my computer. Okay? The problem with all this extra stuff on your computer is, again, it's going to slow down your computer. Okay? The Apple Updater is going to be running in the background. It's going to want to update iTunes all the time. Again, the iPod service is going to be running in the background. It's going to want to check for your iPod being connected all the time. And you can see that's not really useful if you don't have an iPod. Okay? So we try to minimize what's installed on our computer, mainly for that main reason. By installing software, you end up installing a lot of extra stuff that you may or may not need. Okay? So you need to go through that list of software that you've installed and remove stuff that you're not currently using. Sometimes you use a software program once, and then you realize I don't like that software, or I'm not going to use it anymore. And the best thing is just to uninstall it right away. That way you're not have anything on your computer running in the background as well. So that's the first step in cleaning up your computer. But again, it's not a very. Sometimes the uninstalls aren't very clean. They might still leave some remnants over as well. We'll talk about that in a second. So for those that attended the lecture yesterday, I talked about antivirus and anti-spyware programs. So that's another thing you need to do once you've clean up your computer is you want to run a full antivirus scan. Typically, antivirus scans they're called quick scans. So they only scan system files and they only scan programs that are currently running. But typically you want to do a full scan once in a while. They'll scan every single file. So it takes a long time. You typically want to run that overnight because it's going to take a long time to do. But you kind of want to run that a little bit less frequently to do a scan. And what happens with most antivirus programs is before viruses might infect your current files. These days viruses tend to create new files. So what happens with antivirus programs is if they find an infected file, it doesn't actually delete it. It actually moves it to an area called a quarantine. So it's an area where it's kind of a safe area where the virus can't be executed. They're still on your computer. So one thing you want to do is you want to go through the viruses that are found in your quarantine delete those as well. That way they're deleted from your computer. And the application I talked about yesterday, good application for scanning your computer and looking for malware, is a program called Malware by Anti-Malware. It's actually a very good, it's a free tool. It's actually very lightweight. It's not very big. And that program will actually scan through all your system files, and it'll look for really bad malware and remove that as well. And typically, if you have a system file infected, what will happen is it'll require a reboot, because that virus is actually active on your computer. And the only way to fully remove it is to reboot your computer, so it's not starting up again from scratch. Okay, so the other thing you need to do, or you have to be careful with when you're using your computer, is you want to make sure you have enough disk space. Okay, so disk space is kind of the storage area for all your programs, all your files. So typically, that disk space is done with a hard drive. So you have a hard drive. These days, hard drives are very big. But a couple of years ago, hard drives were kind of expensive, so you didn't really buy that big of a hard drive, mainly because it cost you more. So in terms of disk space, again, Windows is stored on your hard drive, and it gets loaded on startup. But the other thing Windows does is it actually uses our hard drive, that hard drive space as part of operation of running Windows. Okay. So my analogy is, if you have a computer, the memory or the RAM is actually sort of analogous to a desk. Okay, and that desk is where you're working with. Okay, and your memory is the size of that desk. The more memory you have, the bigger your desk is. And if you have a big desk, that means you can do a lot of things at once, or you can do a lot of little things at once. Okay. The problem is if you're trying to do a lot of things and your desk is kind of small, you can see you can run into problems. Okay, so what do you do? So what Windows does, if you don't have enough RAM or your desk isn't big enough, so take things that are on your desk that you're not currently using, and it will store them away. Okay, and that'll free up some room on the desk for you to do something else. So if you have to use those items that you put away, then it has to put some other stuff away to free up that area, and then load back what you were working on before. Okay. So that is actually what Windows does if it's out of memory. It uses something called disk caching. It uses what's called a swap block. So it actually stores what was in memory onto your hard drive. And that's a very time-consuming process, especially for computing. Okay? Computing a couple seconds is actually quite a long time. So what happens is if you're just not doing anything on Windows and you notice that your hard drive's shattering a lot or very active, it's because it's disk caching. It's trying to free up that memory. So one thing we need to make sure is we have to have enough free space on our hard drive so we don't run into problems, because Windows needs free space. Okay? And in Windows Vista, what they did was if you didn't have enough free space on your hard drive, it would actually give you a warning. And if you looked at your hard drive, it'd be highlighted in red. It'll say you only have a certain amount of disk space left. And so it kind of warns you. XP doesn't do that, but Vista and Windows 7 does warn you if you don't have enough disk space. So how do you free up disk space? So first thing we talked about, removing applications that we're not using. That'll free up disk space. There's a tool called Disk Cleanup. And Disk Cleanup is part of system tools. That's part of Windows. You can find it under Accessories and System Tools under your Start menu. And what the Disk Cleanup utility will do is it'll remove any temporary files. Typically, you'll have temporary files during the installation process. Also, you get log files as well. Log files tend to be not that big. And there's also something called temporary internet files. Those tend to be fairly big as well.